In a gallery at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles hangs a small oil portrait known as Old Man in Military Costume. A weathered soldier stares out from beneath a plumed helmet, his face carved in shadow and gold light, the kind of face that made Rembrandt van Rijn famous across Europe in the 1600s. For close to 3 centuries, the painting passed through private collections and public galleries as an accepted work by the master himself, admired for its handling of light and its unflinching study of age. Then, in the 20th century, a routine act of conservation turned the painting into something far stranger than anyone expected. When curators passed the canvas beneath an X-ray machine, the plate that came back did not simply confirm a brushstroke or reveal a small pentimento in the old man's collar. It showed another face entirely, a woman, staring out from underneath the soldier, as though she had been waiting there the whole time. She was not a sketch. She was finished, complete, with her own eyes, her own light, her own presence, painted, and then buried beneath a man who was never meant to share her canvas. The question of who she was, and why she disappeared beneath someone else's portrait, has occupied conservators and historians for decades, and it says something uncomfortable about how easily a person can be painted over and forgotten inside a work everyone assumed they already understood. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how a hidden woman ended up sealed beneath a painted soldier, it helps to understand how Rembrandt's workshop actually worked, because the popular image of the lone genius bent over a single commissioned portrait leaves out most of the economics involved. Rembrandt arrived in Amsterdam as a young painter from Leiden in the late 1620s, and within a decade he was running one of the busiest studios in the city, training pupils, filling orders from merchants and civic guilds, and building a reputation that made his name valuable well before he died in poverty in 1669. That studio produced 2 very different kinds of pictures, and the difference between them matters enormously for this story. The first kind were portraits proper, paid for by wealthy patrons who wanted their own likeness rendered in fine detail for the walls of their homes, pictures where every detail of a client's face and dress had to satisfy the person footing the bill. The second kind, and the category that Old Man in Military Costume actually belongs to, were called Tronies. A Tronie was not a portrait of anyone in particular. It was a character study, an old man, a young woman, a soldier, a philosopher, painted from a hired model or from imagination, and sold on the open market to buyers who simply wanted a striking face on their wall, not a specific person's likeness rendered for posterity. Tronies functioned as Rembrandt's laboratory, because no patron was waiting to complain that a nose looked wrong or a collar was the wrong color. He and his students used these smaller, cheaper pictures to experiment with light, texture, and expression in ways a formal commission would never allow. Rembrandt painted dozens of them across his career, sometimes reworking the same model into an old man, then a beggar, then a biblical prophet, testing how far he could push shadow and highlight before the paint stopped reading as a face at all. That freedom had a practical side effect that mattered just as much as the artistic one. Canvas was expensive in the 17th century Dutch Republic. Linen had to be imported, stretched by hand, and primed with layers of ground before a single brushstroke could touch it, and a workshop producing pictures at real volume did not always start every new picture from a blank surface. If a Tronie failed to sell, if a study was judged unsuccessful, or if a piece of canvas from an abandoned composition was simply sitting in storage, it made plain economic sense to turn the fabric around and begin again, rather than spend money on new material. This was common practice across many workshops of the period, not unique to Rembrandt's studio, documented in inventories and in the paintings themselves whenever conservators think to look beneath the surface. It explains a detail that researchers eventually confirmed about Old Man in Military Costume once the X-ray plates were examined closely. The woman beneath the soldier was not painted in the same orientation as the man above her. When researchers mapped the radiographic data against the visible surface, they found that her portrait had been executed with the canvas turned in a different position, meaning that at some point the fabric was physically rotated before the second image, the old soldier, was begun on top of her. She was not damaged, scraped away, or painted over because someone disliked the result. She was simply repurposed, treated as a surface rather than a finished work, inside a workshop culture, where canvas was currency and unsold pictures became raw material for the next attempt. The identity and authorship of the visible painting itself has not always been settled either, and that separate uncertainty is part of why the X-ray discovery mattered so much to scholars far beyond the single museum that owns it. For most of its documented history, Old Man in Military Costume was accepted without serious debate as an autograph work by Rembrandt, meaning a painting made substantially by his own hand, rather than a workshop assistant working in his style for the open market. That confidence began to erode in the second half of the 20th century, when a group of Dutch art historians founded what became known as the Rembrandt Research Project in 1968. Their goal was ambitious, and in hindsight, genuinely destabilizing for museums across the world that had built entire wings and reputations around paintings labeled with his name. Rembrandt's fame had made his signature valuable for centuries, and generations of dealers, collectors, and even well-meaning curators had a financial and reputational incentive to attribute uncertain paintings to the master, rather than to his many pupils, several of whom, including Ferdinand Bol and Govert Flinck, painted in styles close enough to Rembrandt's own that even trained eyes struggled to tell the difference with confidence. The Rembrandt Research Project set out to examine the entire accepted body of his work, using tools that went beyond connoisseurship alone. Dendrochronology allowed scientists to date the wooden panels some paintings were made on by counting tree rings, establishing the earliest possible date a panel could have been cut and used. Pigment analysis could identify materials that were not yet available or affordable at the time a painting was supposedly made, ruling out attributions on purely material grounds. And X-ray imaging, the same technology that would later expose the hidden woman in the Getty's soldier portrait, let researchers see beneath the visible surface of dozens of paintings across European and American collections, comparing brushwork, revisions, and underlying structure against what was already documented of Rembrandt's genuine working habits from securely dated pictures. The project's findings reshaped the field over the following decades, and not always gently. Paintings that had hung for generations under gold-lettered plaques reading Rembrandt van Rijn were reclassified in scholarly publications as Circle of Rembrandt, Workshop of Rembrandt, or attributed outright to an unnamed pupil, sometimes over the strong objections of the museums that owned them and had built ticket sales around the association. The most famous casualty was Man with the Golden Helmet, a painting in Berlin's Gemäldegalerie, so beloved that reproductions of it hung in homes across Europe for a century, its glinting armor treated as a textbook example of Rembrandt's mastery of light on metal. In 1985, the Rembrandt Research Project concluded, based on technical and stylistic evidence gathered over years of study, that the painting was almost certainly the work of an unknown student, rather than Rembrandt himself. The public reaction was not scholarly detachment. People felt as though something had been taken from them, even though the physical painting on the wall had not changed in the slightest, only the name attached to the small plaque beside it. Old Man in Military Costume was swept into this same current of reassessment, given the layered, reused canvas revealed beneath its surface, and lingering questions about the confidence and consistency of the brushwork in the visible soldier compared with securely documented Rembrandt paintings from the same period. Scholars associated with the Reattribution effort moved the painting into a more cautious category, acknowledging Rembrandt's likely influence and possibly his direct involvement in parts of the work, while stopping short of calling it entirely his own hand from start to finish. The Getty did not hide from this ambiguity once the research was complete, which is worth noting because museums have not always handled downgraded attributions gracefully. Rather than moving the painting into storage without comment, curators kept it on view and updated its wall text to reflect the layered, uncertain nature of what it actually is, a decision that turned a potentially embarrassing reassessment into an opportunity to show visitors how technical art history actually works behind the scenes, rather than something museums would rather visitors never think about at all. Old Man in Military Costume is not even the most contested case to come out of this decades-long reassessment. The Polish Rider, a dramatic equestrian portrait long housed at the Frick collection in New York, has swung back and forth in scholarly opinion for the better part of a century, at times confidently labeled a Rembrandt, at other times reassigned to Willem Drost, one of his most talented pupils, and at other times left in a deliberately unresolved category because the evidence on both sides is strong enough that no consensus has ever fully taken hold. Cases like this illustrate just how much of the historical Rembrandt canon rests on judgment calls rather than certainty. Judgment calls that shift as new tools and new generations of scholars revisit the same physical objects with fresh eyes and better instruments. To understand why a painting like Old Man in Military Costume existed at all, it helps to look at what was fashionable among Amsterdam's collecting class in the 1630s and 40s. Alongside formal portraiture, There was a genuine appetite among wealthy buyers for pictures of figures in dramatic, unfamiliar costume, soldiers in plumed helmets, men wrapped in turbans suggesting the eastern trade routes that made Amsterdam rich, elderly figures dressed as biblical patriarchs or philosophers from antiquity. These tronies let a buyer display worldliness and taste without needing any connection to the person depicted, and Rembrandt, along with pupils like Bol and Flink, produced them in real volume to meet that demand. A soldier in an ornate helmet was a reliable, sellable subject, the kind of image a workshop could return to again and again with small variations, which is precisely why an unsold or unsuccessful canvas bearing an entirely different face might reasonably get turned around and reused for one more attempt at a soldier that would actually find a buyer. Behind every one of these pictures sat a working studio that looked very little like the solitary genius setting so often imagined today. Apprentices ground pigments by hand from raw minerals and plant material, mixing them with oil to the exact consistency a master demanded. Canvas arrived by ship, often from Haarlem or further afield, and had to be stretched over a wooden frame and coated with layers of chalk and glue sizing before a single figure could be sketched onto its surface. Materials were tracked, reused, and argued over, because a workshop's profitability depended on managing cost as much as it depended on talent. Understanding this working environment changes how the hidden woman reads. She is not evidence of a deliberate betrayal or a dramatic act of erasure. She is evidence of a business, one where an unsold or unfinished picture became the physical foundation for the next attempt at something the market actually wanted, and where nobody at the time thought twice about painting directly over a finished face because the canvas underneath it was simply too valuable to waste. The financial stakes behind an attribution like this are larger than they might first appear, and they help explain why the Rembrandt research project's conclusions were met with resistance from more than just sentimental attachment. A painting confirmed as an autograph Rembrandt can be worth many times more than the same picture reclassified as workshop or circle of Rembrandt, a difference that affects insurance valuations, loan negotiations between museums, and the prestige a collection can claim when a masterwork bears the master's own name rather than an approximate one. Curators who had spent careers defending a painting's authenticity sometimes found their scholarship effectively overturned by a scan, and some of the project's own members later admitted that certainty had occasionally outpaced the evidence in the opposite direction as well, with a small number of paintings once demoted later reconsidered and partially reinstated as later phases of research applied a lighter, more cautious touch than the sweeping first wave of reattributions had allowed. That back and forth is not usually mentioned in wall text or gift shop postcards, but it is very much part of the real, unfinished history behind a name as famous as Rembrandt's, a name that turns out to rest on a surprisingly fragile and constantly revised foundation once you start pulling at the threads holding it together. Even the physical dimensions of Old Man in military costume hint at its origins as a working studio piece rather than a grand commissioned statement. It is a modest, close-cropped composition, sized for a study rather than a formal hall portrait, the kind of picture meant to sit comfortably in a private room where a collector could examine the brushwork up close rather than admire it from across a reception hall. That modesty is easy to overlook next to a painting like The Night Watch, but it matters here because small, market-facing tronies like this one were exactly the type of picture most likely to get recycled, reworked, and reused again when the first attempt did not sell the way the workshop hoped it would. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What makes the X-ray evidence so striking is how completely finished the second image turned out to be, and how much that completeness tells us about the woman underneath. X-ray imaging works by passing radiation through the layers of a painting and recording how much of it is absorbed before reaching a detector or photographic plate positioned on the other side. Paint made with lead white, a pigment used constantly in the 17th century for flesh tones, highlights, and underpainting, is extremely dense and blocks X-rays effectively, which means areas painted with lead register as bright, sharply defined shapes on the resulting image, while thinner or lead-free paint layers barely register at all and appear closer to a shadow. When conservators examined the radiograph of Old Man in military costume, the woman's face did not appear as a faint outline or an abandoned first attempt scraped back to bare canvas the way an unfinished study might. She appeared with mottled cheeks, defined shadow beneath her jaw, and clear highlights along her hairline. the unmistakable signature of a completed painting rather than a discarded sketch someone gave up on halfway through. Someone had finished her portrait with the same care and materials used elsewhere in the workshop before another artist, or possibly the same artist working later in his career, turned the canvas and began the old soldier directly on top of her, without any attempt to remove or soften what was already there beneath the new ground layer. In the decades since the original X-ray was taken, conservation science has only sharpened this picture, sometimes quite literally. Newer imaging techniques, including macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, allow researchers to map the density of paint layers and the specific chemical elements present within the pigments themselves, distinguishing between different sources of white, red, and ochre paint with a precision that older radiography alone could never offer on its own. Applying this technology to the Getty painting let conservators separate details that had blurred together in earlier scans taken decades before, sharpening a picture that earlier equipment could only hint at, clarifying the line of the woman's collar, the suggestion of jewelry or fabric gathered at her shoulder, and brushwork patterns that some specialists believe are consistent with techniques associated with Rembrandt's own hand in other securely confirmed works from the same period, though this remains a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion rather than settled fact anyone can point to with certainty. No documentation survives naming the woman. No preparatory drawing has been matched to her face. No inventory from the period describes a portrait fitting her description being sold, gifted, or painted over by a later hand. She exists today only as data, a pattern of absorbed and reflected radiation, reconstructed into an image on a screen, a face with no name attached to it, hidden inside a painting that itself spent centuries circulating under a name that may not have been fully accurate either. Some historians who have studied the scans closely have floated the idea that the woman may have been an earlier Tronie in her own right, perhaps painted years before the soldier, during a period when Rembrandt, or a close associate, was working through similar studies of aged and youthful faces for the open market. Others are more cautious, pointing out that a confident, finished female portrait sealed beneath a male one, oriented at a different angle, could just as easily represent an entirely separate artist's work that came into the workshop secondhand, bought cheaply for its usable canvas rather than its subject. Without a signature, a document, or a matching preparatory sketch, the honest answer is that nobody currently knows for certain, and every specialist who has examined the scans is quick to say so, rather than overstate what the evidence can support. A few researchers have tried a different approach, setting the hidden woman's brushwork alongside other confirmed female Tronies from Rembrandt's circle, comparing the direction and pressure of individual strokes around the eyes and mouth, the kind of detail that is nearly impossible to fake or imitate consistently across an entire face. The comparisons are suggestive rather than conclusive. Some passages in the underlying portrait show a confidence and economy of stroke that specialists associate with an experienced hand working quickly and surely, qualities frequently cited in genuine Rembrandt studies, while other passages remain too obscured by the paint layers above them to analyze with any real confidence at all. It is the kind of evidence that invites a strong opinion and rewards none, which is exactly why the scholarly literature on this particular painting tends to read more like a careful list of open questions than a triumphant announcement of a solved mystery. When the Getty first shared the imaging results publicly, the response from visitors and press coverage alike focused less on the technical detail and more on the simple, almost eerie fact of it. A stranger's face discovered sealed inside a painting people had walked past for years without suspecting anything unusual was there at all. That reaction says something honest about how most people actually experience paintings in a museum. A visitor standing in front of old man in military costume sees confident brushwork, a weathered face, a plumed helmet catching the light, and has no reason whatsoever to suspect that the canvas beneath their eyes is doing double duty, holding two lives instead of one. Even conservators who spend their careers examining paint layers for a living have described the moment of first seeing the woman's face resolve out of the radiographic static as genuinely unsettling, less like reading a scientific instrument and more like watching a photograph slowly develop in a darkroom, a face rising out of nothing that clearly was not supposed to still be there. There are subtler clues on the visible surface itself, for anyone who knows to look, though none of them are obvious without specialized equipment. Under raking light, meaning light directed at a sharp, low angle across the canvas rather than straight on, conservators can sometimes trace faint variations in the surface texture of a painting that correspond to changes in what lies underneath, tiny ridges and valleys in the paint that formed as the top layer dried and settled unevenly over the different thickness of paint below it. In photographs taken this way of old man in military costume, careful viewers have pointed to slight irregularities near the soldier's shoulder and collar that align suspiciously well with where the woman's hairline and collar sit in the X-ray, as if the ghost of her portrait is still faintly pressing up through 3.5 centuries of paint and varnish, visible only if you already know exactly where to look, and only under exactly the right kind of light. The layered uncertainty is almost dizzying when you sit with it directly. A painting once confidently called Rembrandt, later downgraded by scholars using the very same imaging technology that exposed the woman, contains within its own physical structure a second painting, by some assessments just as accomplished as the one visible on the surface, that no one can currently attribute to anyone at all. Old Man in Military Costume is far from the only Rembrandt painting that scientific imaging has rewritten in recent years. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam began an extensive public research initiative in 2019, popularly known as Operation Nightwatch, focused on Rembrandt's largest and most famous painting, The Night Watch, completed in 1642. Using high-resolution photography stitched together from thousands of individual close-up images, along with macro X-ray fluorescence scanning, similar to the method later refined for the Getty portrait, researchers uncovered a series of changes Rembrandt made as he worked: adjustments to the position of a dog near the bottom edge, alterations to a soldier's stance and the angle of a raised arm, and pigment choices that had shifted or discolored over the centuries, in ways that changed how the painting's original color balance would have appeared to viewers standing in front of it in the 17th century. Perhaps the most well-documented fact about the Night Watch, confirmed and clarified rather than discovered by this research, is that the painting visitors see today is not actually complete. In 1715, the canvas was trimmed on all four sides so that it would fit between two doors in a new location inside Amsterdam's town hall, removing a strip of the composition permanently, including two full figures that had originally stood along the left edge of the scene, because a contemporary painter named Gerrit Lundens had made a smaller painted copy of the full composition before the trimming took place. Researchers have been able to reconstruct, at least visually and digitally, what those missing sections once contained, effectively resurrecting a piece of the painting that has not physically existed in its original form for more than 300 years. Seen alongside the discovery at the Getty, these findings point to something larger than any single hidden face or any single trimmed edge sitting in storage somewhere as an afterthought. They point to the fact that Rembrandt's paintings, and the paintings that came out of his workshop more broadly, were never as fixed or final as the varnished, gold-framed objects hanging in museum galleries today tend to suggest to a passing visitor. Canvases were reused when money was tight or a study did not sell. Compositions were altered mid-process as an artist changed his mind about a pose or a shadow. Entire figures disappeared, sometimes by the original artist's own hand and sometimes by later interventions, like the 1715 trimming carried out long after Rembrandt himself was gone and had no say in the matter. The technology that lets us see these changes today did not exist for most of the centuries these paintings have hung on display, which means that generations of viewers stood in front of the Night Watch, admiring a composition that was already physically incomplete, and generations of viewers stood in front of Old Man in Military Costume without the faintest idea that a second, entirely different person was looking back at them from beneath the paint the entire time. One question remains that no amount of imaging technology has been able to answer, and it deserves to be sat with honestly rather than resolved with false confidence for the sake of a tidy ending. Conservators at the Getty have deliberately chosen not to physically remove the visible portrait of the soldier in order to expose the woman underneath, and that choice is worth explaining, rather than treating as an oversight. Doing so would require stripping away centuries of paint that constitute a genuine, finished, historically significant work in its own right, purely on the chance of recovering a second image that might turn out to be damaged in ways the X-ray cannot detect, incomplete at its edges, or simply duller once exposed to open air and direct light after 3.5 centuries sealed away in the dark. That decision reflects a broader principle running through modern conservation science, one that generally prioritizes preserving what visibly exists over gambling it away in pursuit of what might exist underneath. However tempting the second image might be, the woman will likely remain exactly as she is now, a presence rendered visible only through radiation and data, reconstructed on screens and in scholarly publications, but never again seen with the naked eye in oil and pigment, the way she would once have appeared to whoever sat for her, or whoever painted her from memory. For visitors who walk through the Getty's galleries today, Old man in military costume looks the same as it has for decades. A striking, confidently painted study of age and armor. The kind of picture that draws people in simply for the quality of light falling across a weathered face and a dented helmet. Almost none of them know that a woman is looking back at them from behind his shoulder, sealed into the very same piece of fabric, waiting for whatever the next generation of scanning technology might eventually reveal about who she was and why her finished portrait became someone else's raw material on a workshop floor centuries ago. Art history spent most of its existence relying almost entirely on the trained eye, on connoisseurs who built entire careers on being able to look at a single brushstroke and simply know whose hand had made it, with little way to test that instinct against anything harder than reputation and consensus. That approach produced real insight over the centuries, but it also produced confident mistakes, attributions built on market pressure and wishful thinking, as much as evidence. Mistakes that stood unquestioned for generations, because no one had a way to look past the surface of the paint and check. X-ray imaging and the more sophisticated scanning technologies that followed it into museum conservation labs changed that relationship permanently and in ways still being worked out today. Evidence buried inside the physical object itself, invisible to even the most practiced and confident eye, can now overturn assumptions that took root centuries ago and never faced a serious challenge until a machine finally looked somewhere no human ever could. Old man in military costume sits in its gallery today as a quiet argument for that shift, a small portrait that spent close to 300 years being admired for exactly the wrong reasons, its true complexity resting not in the confident brushwork of the soldier visible on its surface, but in the untold story of a nameless woman sealed just beneath him, waiting patiently inside the weave of the canvas for someone with the right machine to finally notice she was there. Scanning technology has not stopped improving since the Getty's last major study, and conservators working on other Rembrandt paintings continue to find new details every few years that older equipment simply could not resolve, which means the story of this particular soldier and the woman beneath him is very unlikely to be finished. Somewhere in a research archive, a slightly sharper scan may already be sitting on a hard drive right now, waiting quite patiently for someone with the right question and the right kind of patience to look again and notice something everyone before them somehow missed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.